When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Hello. Hey, welcome back, people and friends and family and everyone, to the Erudition Network. This is our interactive Black History podcast, and I am your host. One here. I invite you to join us every week as we journey into our history. And I'd like to thank any of you who are joining us for the first time. I am Eddie K. Phillips. If you don't know, I am a public historian, the author of the Erudition Network Presents 101 Black History Questions Challenge. This wonderful book here that you can go get on Amazon in digital or in print form. And I'm also your guide tonight through history. For our returning listeners, I want to welcome you back. You already know that this is where you come in here to learn your history, to dive deep, to go unfiltered, make sure that we touch on things unafraid. And that's what we're going to do tonight. Tonight's episode takes us straight into a lot of facts that are too often buried, hidden, not talked about in our schools, not provided in our culture. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about Black resistance. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about the betrayal that happens in our culture, both politically, socially, and the deliberate erasure from the end of slavery, the Reconstruction, even until now. And we're not just going to talk about slavery or civil rights, those broad strokes, those people who we know, those people who we're going to talk about some hidden things. We're going to talk about some things that haven't been talked about often. We're going to get into the broken promises, even by some who we have told ourselves that we can trust, and political betrayals that have happened with both parties. One of our viewers asked us to go into how these parties were formed and why the back and forth with Black people. And what you're about to hear isn't in most textbooks. It's not going to be something that you have gotten from your history classes in high school or elementary school. No, we're gonna delve, and we're gonna touch on those things and be honest, because this has to be a raw and honest exploration. And we'll have some heavy truths. There will be questions that I want you to ponder, and there'll be questions that I may ask you as we engage in this. So I want you, as I tell you every week, when you watch this, either if you join live tonight or if you catch us the recording on YouTube later, I want you to get a text, get you a notebook, and I want you to start writing down names, writing down some of the things that you may not have heard of that we'll cover tonight. Because this may get a little personal, this might get a little real, but it's also now. So I want to let you know before we dive in, just a quick content warning. Tonight's episode will talk about racial violence. We're going to talk about some lynchings. We're going to talk about arson. We're going to talk about murder. And though it is something that we don't really want to dwell on, it's a painful but necessary truth that we need to hear. And so we're going to go into that tonight. There's a famous saying that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And we don't want to repeat the mistakes of our past. We want to make sure that we are ready and we are open to learn. So let's get into this. Tonight's episode, I titled it Hidden History of Black Resistance, Blood, Betrayal, and the Fight for Truth. It seems like a very big title, but the truth is that it is so small to encapsulate everything that has happened within our culture and with our people. I know that we're on at 8 tonight, and that's a little late. So if you're watching the recording of this, I still want you to engage as if you were live. I want you to drop a question in the remarks section on YouTube. I want you to put it in the Facebook chats. I want you to engage. So please do so. But let's get into this. I want you to think about where we are right now and all of the issues that we're facing right now. And I want you to see it as a cyclical thing, right? Because if we were to go back to say 1865, the Civil War has just ended. We have a lot of our ancestors, estimated 4 to 6 million formerly enslaved Black people, are free. They're hopeful, they're joyous, they're uncertain. They don't really know what is in the future, but they're hopeful. And for a very brief moment, they believe that America can change. This period, historians, we call it the Reconstruction era. And Black Americans took the Reconstruction era and took their acceptance into regular society wholeheartedly. They invested in their education, their voting rights, their political participation. In fact, by 1868, there were over 80 to 90%, let's say about 85% of eligible Black men were already registered to vote. Just under 90% having been freed and having been given the right to vote. Black children were attending schools and learning for the first time. Black people were participating in Southern legislatures, serving in Congress. And even though our history books don't go so much into talking about how they affected Congress, they were in it. And this era was an era of joy and possibility. Lincoln, before he was assassinated, had said that this country needed a new birth of freedom in his Gettysburg Address. And Black people believe that. However, having freed Black people, everyone wasn't ready to accept them as equals. And though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ended slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and gave us the right to vote, a lot of whites erupted in violent backlash. Former slaveholders and ex-Confederate people launched campaigns of terror. They qualified it by saying that Black people were ignorant, that Black men were inherently violent. We hear that even today in our media. White men formed militant groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League. And they used intimidation and violence to stop Black progress. Freedmen, who tried to vote or assert their given rights by the Constitution, were hampered down. Brutal retaliation was done against them. Going to vote for the first time wasn't like it is for today when you go to vote. People were waiting for you. Mobs threatened you. People died just to cast a ballot. And all of this done under the guise of freedom. The lie in the law said that men were free and that you could vote. Harper's Weekly, there's a very famous picture of Harper's Weekly showing Black men at a window going to vote for the first time. And in that picture, I'm gonna try to share it. In that picture, you see a soldier having fought for his freedom, being down there standing in line, waiting to cast his ballot. It was a triumphant thing for Blacks to be able to go and vote. For Black men who worked with their families and their churches and got together and decided on what candidate would be best for them. This was what life was. But in places like Louisiana and Mississippi, there was violence. There were massacres. White mobs attacked Black officials and communities. Sometimes they did it in the broad daylight, not just at night. They didn't just do night rides as we have been told about the Klan. They did it in broad daylight. A few weeks ago, I told you guys about a notorious example of the Colfax Massacre in 1873 in Louisiana, that during a contested local election, white paramilitary people overran the courthouse, defended by Black freedmen who were only there to try to use their constitutional right. And when the smoke cleared, hundreds of Black people lay dead. And violence spread. But it sent a message. White supremacists would kill their neighbors and kill Blacks before they would accept Black political power. And the consequence was nothing. In fact, as I told you, in U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876, the Supreme Court of the United States, very similar to what we're dealing now, basically passed the laws, or I should say passed the law, validated the fact that there was nothing that the federal government would do to protect Black life. There was no charges against the Colfax killers. There was no charges that were presented against these people that could put them in jail for the murders that they committed of hundreds of people. The military, paramilitary, the police groups, all of them allowed nighttime terror, and this was common. And so we focus on the nighttime terror, but we forget that sometimes they did it in the broad daylight. And they harmed, hurt, killed, and wounded. It is so bad to look back at those times and understand that there was a reason why the betrayal happened. As people were voted into office, and as people got back outside of the Civil War, they realized, yeah, I don't really think that they're equal to us. The abolitionists who had fought for Blacks even turned on them because they were angry that the Black men got the vote over the white women. So by 1877, Reconstruction had failed. The politics crumbled it. The relentless violence in the South achieved its goal. Compromises were made. If you go back and look between 1865 and 1877, thousands of Black Americans were killed, attacked. Black women were sexually assaulted. with impunity. And nothing was done. Federal troops who had been sent there by the President Ulysses S. Grant to protect those voters were withdrawn with the Compromise of 1877, which handed the election to Rutherford B. Hayes and allowed violence to return to the South. Once the troops left, once black men had to take off their uniforms and could no longer patrol to protect, white supremacists regained power. They called this era of their power regain the redemption. And you will hear, even to this day, how they said they were redeeming the South. Redeeming it from what? From black rule, from black people. Black people were driven out of office. They were murdered. W.B. Du Bois said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then they pushed him back towards slavery. This is what it is. And so right now, as we look at the laws that are being put throughout America, all of the shifts that are being done, remember what I told you at the beginning, the circle, the cyclical mentality of the law. This is why Black families carry deep intergenerational trauma and mistrust of the government, of people, because they always feel, rightfully so, that it will be snatched from them. It is a sad, sad commentary on America that even to this day, we pass laws and we make statements politically to disenfranchise Black people, to suggest that the violence given towards them, the policing of them, the unfair treatment of them, the lowering and economic status of them is all justified because they don't deserve it anyway. We have to redeem, make America great again. By the end of Reconstruction, white supremacists had effectively overthrown interracial democracy in the South. They had removed the Black politicians who had came in to service and rebuild their cities. Congress abandoned Blacks. Activists abandoned Blacks. Blacks ran from the South to the North to abandon the lands in which their families had planted, worked, and built. So by the time of 1877, the dream of equitable multiracial society that was perpetuated with the start of Reconstruction was gone. Historians at the time were calling Reconstruction a failure and blaming it on Blacks. And the 12-year window from the Civil War to the end of Reconstruction could have changed this nation to the positive. But we spend very little time talking about it in our schools. We spend very little time talking about the massacres in our schools. And now we have politicians who are telling us we shouldn't talk about it at all. We shouldn't worry about it. It shouldn't be something that we bring to the forefront. But let me ask you a question. How many of these Reconstruction era atrocities were you taught in school? Were you taught about the robbing of Blacks who put their money, freemen who put their money into the Freedmen Bank and had it robbed and taken with no one being held accountable. Were you told about the cities and the people that got killed and the things that happened? Did you know about Cruikshank? Did you know about the Supreme Court saying that the federal government couldn't do anything to protect newly freed Black people? No, many of us don't, because the pattern of erasing Black history is something we are encountering again and again and again, and it is a betrayal. It is something that we just don't seem to know about. In 1866 in New Orleans, right after the Civil War, New Orleans became the site of one of the worst and first violent betrayals of Reconstruction. Black veterans who had served in the Civil War and delegates, right? They gathered at a place called Mechanics Hall. Their goal was simple. They were going to push for a new state constitution that would grant Blacks the right to vote by the state constitution. But outside, again, whites got angry. White police officers, many of them who had fought for the Confederacy, surrounded the building. And they ran in and they shot, clubbed, beat, hung Blacks. By the end of that day, at least 34 delegates and Black veterans were dead. That's the count. Many believe it was more. Newspapers at the time called it a riot. They called it a riot because they didn't want it to seem like the Civil War had failed. Remember, they said toward the end they were fighting for the freedom of Blacks. But others were honest. This was a massacre. Police who had been sworn and people who had been sworn and military folks who had been sworn to protect stormed a political meeting and gunned down people simply because they didn't want them to vote. In 1868, St. Bernard Parish, again, Louisiana. The massacre came at the eve of a historic moment, the first presidential election in which Blacks could vote. And in St. Bernard Parish, just outside of New Orleans, Black freemen were planning to go and vote. But what was said was that they were planning to rise up and attack whites. It was a lie. But the white folks took that lie and that fear, and white paramilitary groups again mobilized and decided that they would prevent the trouble. And over days and weeks, white mobs went house to house, dragging Black men from their homes and executing them. Let me repeat that. Executing them in the presence of their families and in the streets. People were shot in the fields, on their porches, walking down the road, in front of their churches. Churches were burned over weeks. Historians lie and say it was probably about over 100, but more than that. And the aftermath was exactly what these killers intended. Blacks did not turn out to vote in that parish. White supremacists secured local power in that parish. And then Black people abandoned that town. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated. This was to disenfranchise. If we look at the 1868 campaign poster promoting Black suffrage, you know, the one you saw at the Black man voting, and then think about people being killed that same year. This is what we had to deal with. And this is what is now starting to trickle back into our lives again. Not as violent. No, they're not shooting you on your porch, but they're taking away your opportunities. Fast forward 1910. Reconstruction is long gone. America had moved on. But in a small Texas town named Slocum, it happened again. And it was again disguised as community panic. It always starts with a whisper, someone lying. White residents claimed that black families were arming for an uprising. They were going to come get us. There was no evidence, just fear-mongering. But the rumor was enough. It was enough. And on the 29th of July, hundreds of armed white men flooded into Slocum. They hunted. I'm going to repeat that. They hunted the residents of Slocum like prey. They let them run. And they hunted them down. They shot them in the fields. Women and children were shot as they fled. Newspaper men reported on this. White men went door to door. And if you didn't run, they were shooting anyone that they could find. This is what they dealt with. And this is the situation where we're now hearing today. I heard that black men are violent. Black men will raise that, if not properly educated, will just grow up to be violent. But we lie, right? We lie, and we don't tell the full story. Historians have documented at least about 5,000 racial terror lynchings in America. They estimate between 1877 and 1950. And many historians will tell you that's a conservative count. They know that it's likely higher. They know that thousands probably were killed, and that many people avoided justice. But the history is ignored, and we can go and tell rhetoric about how black men and women are violent. This is a horrible situation to look back on, but it's the fact. It's the fact. Despite all of things like that, we strive to stay resistant. Ida B. Wells, I've told you guys before, she wrote a Red Record. She talked about the lynchings. We fought through Red Summer. I won't go further back into Red Summer, and we fought through that with the violence all over the country in 1919. But at the heart of all of this, the reason that I'm bringing it up tonight, the reason that I'm going kind of back over some of it, is that when we hear people tell lies on television and our media today, and we are not armed with these facts, then what we do is we fall into a trap. Into a trap. Let's talk about Washington, D.C., because this is what the current administration was talking about. I wonder, do any of them remember what happened in 1919 in Washington, D.C., where they said young men are violent? I wonder, do they know the story of what happened that July when white rioters, including many who were disgruntled World War I veterans, started a 4-day attack beating any black people that they found. And black civilians and black veterans had to fight back. And they turned the nation's capital into a battleground. They had to pull out their guns to fight off the white mobs. I wonder, do they know that story of how whites ran into black neighborhoods and black churches and black communities and attacked people? Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Week, what became Black History Month, talked about driving and seeing people being pulled out of their vehicles, beaten in the street. When they talk about Chicago, I wonder, do they remember in 1919 the clash at Lake Michigan Beach, where a black teenager named Eugene Williams happened to drift into a whites-only swimming area just for a moment and was stoned to death by white beachgoers, and then set off an all-out race riot in Chicago where hundreds were injured, many were killed. But Chicago now is violent. No troops sent to protect black lives. People went in to hunt down black people. I look at what we are right now, and I think we ignore the mass murders. The things that happen in places like Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, New York. We talk about Tulsa in 1921, but we very rarely talk about the violence that had consumed us in 1919. But Black Wall Street is horrible too. An entirely self-sufficient community burned to the ground simply out of jealousy and anger. Tulsa in 1921 was a booming city, a rich city. But that didn't matter, because in the end of the day, the land, the politics, and where we are, things were allowed. If anything should be taught to you in this particular session, is that Black success is often met with racist whites furious. Because their jealousy and perverse fear drives them to do things. And the law, in person, all it takes is a spark, and they look for that spark. You know, we get told about Tulsa, right? We get told about Tulsa, but we're never really told about Tulsa. This was after World War I, and veterans had guns, and black men in Tulsa, almost 100 of them, marched to the courthouse, right, to try to go protect a man named Dick Rowland, right? And the sheriff told them to leave, assuring them that the jail was secure. And when these men left, a white mob grew, right? And then another group of 100 or so black men returned to stand guard. Our ancestors were not people who just gave over. They were not. I hate those shirts that say I'm not my ancestor. A white man confronted one of the black veterans. He grabbed his gun, and in a scuffle, the gun went off. And in that, a fuse was lit. Immediately, the white mob began shooting at the black men, and the black men returned fire. The black men were heavily outnumbered. They retreated towards Greenwood. The whites pursued them, shooting and shouting. shooting and shouting, and all through the night, just chaos. We're not told that part. We're told as if Black people were just slaughtered and they were running. No, they tried to fight back. That's why people started to throw down dynamite and blow up buildings. That's why when, even after the buildings were burning, when Blacks were trying and firefighters were trying to douse the fires, the white people came along and at gunpoint and cut the hoses or drove the firemen off at gunpoint to make sure that those buildings burned. But you're not told about the Black people who tried to fight back unfairly because of unfair treatment. We try here on Erudition, and I'm very calm tonight because I want to make this very clear to whoever watches this, that these facts have to be shared. They have to be shared. If we were sharing facts more openly, and we were trying to get people, because there were whites who stood right along with Blacks and were killed in a lot of these riots. That's another part we don't talk about. But if we stood more to teach history collectively, we wouldn't have the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, where white men thought that they could go and grab a young Black boy from his family's house in the middle of the night, slaughter him, massacre him, and leave his body laying at the bottom of a river. We wouldn't have that. Maybe we wouldn't have had to have the civil rights movement, the things happening in Birmingham, Alabama, the 16th Street Baptist Church being bombed, where people minimize the idea of young Black life. Maybe we wouldn't have had to have the Alabama Freedom Riders being beat almost to death simply because they wanted to make sure that Blacks and whites can ride on an interstate bus together. Maybe we wouldn't have had the death of a Medgar Evers, a Martin Luther King Jr., a Malcolm X. Maybe we wouldn't have had the three civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, murdered simply because they wanted to go down together and help Blacks in the South. This is all history that is never really shared openly. Maybe we would be open about what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, March 7, 1965, where state troopers, we forget that part, state troopers who's supposed to protect went in and attacked the protesters and beat them down with billy clubs and ran them down with horses. Maybe we wouldn't have riots. But this is an issue because now we're telling ourselves we don't even want to share the history. And then the history that we do share, right? It depends on where you're getting it from. Today, I had a friend in the Navy who posted an idea that there had been 14 presidents before George Washington. I know some of you out there probably have heard this same salacious history, right? But this was said, and it was wrong. And the reason that it was wrong was because, again, a lot of people tell half-truths, and they don't know how to do the proper research. There were no 14 presidents before George Washington. George Washington was president designed by the Constitution, which meant that the Constitution is what gave him his powers in the executive branch. It didn't matter that a man like John Hancock, John Hanson, Thomas Mifflin, and any all these other people who signed different documents of meetings for the Congressional Congress, whatever they wanted to call themselves, they were meeting heads. Then someone chimed in and said, I make no, denigration of that person. They said, oh, well, John Henson was a black man. Well, there is a black John Henson who was a Liberian politician, but it was not the same John Henson who stood over a Constitutional Congress meeting. But the thing that historians are supposed to do is provide you facts, guidance, and ways to get those facts. To tell you to go to the Library of Congress, to tell you what books you might want to go pick up, to go tell you first, second source information. I don't want to get off of here tonight and pretend that people can't do they can't go and look things up for themselves. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we have to be better and do our job in due diligence, find places like this or find others and challenge. I think tonight, going over a lot of this, I really just wanted us to understand that the violence that happened had its purpose. And there are things that are going on right now that are going to be just as bad if we don't take the time. If we don't take the time to do better. So I wanted to be calm with this tonight because I knew that there would be a lot of things that were sensitive. And I'm answering the question here, and I wanted to make sure that we went over it. I also want you guys to understand this isn't interactive. There are a couple of people on here. If you have something to say, hey, say it. If you disagree with what has been said, I'm here for you also. But I want you to interact with this program because I think it's important. Nothing. Y'all got nothing for me. Well, I'm gonna tell you this. A friend of mine. I don't want to get off here tonight also and not talk about the party system. A friend of mine asked a question last week, and he wanted to understand why the political parties, as they are, why they have flipped-flopped the way they have over the. I was trying to pull up his question. Because what we see a lot of times in the country, there it is. He asks, I would love a discussion on Black history and the Democratic Party during Jim Crow and Republican Party after the New Deal. Why Black people are still mad at Obama? Did he really not do anything for Black people? And attacks on African-American history and the watering down. So I think we covered that part pretty well today. But here's the thing. Jim Crow and the Democrats. The Democrats and the Republicans are just as guilty, are just as vile in their history um, together and how they have failed Black people. If you were to look at the parties and even go back, right, you will know that the Democrats, the Dixiecrats, used to be the racist party, right? Any historian can tell you that, and that the party of Lincoln was later supposed to be seen as the more accepting party for Blacks, but it is not necessarily true. Remember, Lincoln himself said that he would, if he could unite the nation during the Civil War without freeing the slaves, he would. If he could do it in freeing the slaves, he would. Initially, Lincoln had no meet into what was going on, right? He had no care other than bringing the Union back. So to say that the Republican Party of that time was any less racist, bigoted, would be wrong. And so I think that we have to look at what led Blacks to that. The reason why a lot of Blacks coming out of the Civil War became Republicans was because of Lincoln. Simply because of Lincoln. And because of the results of the Civil War and going into Reconstruction, as we talked about earlier, many of them thought, okay, this is a time in which what we can do is expand and actually become part of the citizenry. After Reconstruction, so the Democrats, off those Dixiecrats, they went right into the Jim Crow system, the Black codes. They passed state laws mandating segregated cities, schools, housing, public areas. So they were no friend of Blacks. The Democratic political machines tolerated, and then later on, throughout time, encouraged lynching as a part of political power. White primaries, poll taxes, literacy tests, right? All of those things were done by what was the Democratic Party. It created Black distrust. Now, the Republicans, since the Civil War during that time, Blacks support them because people like Ulysses S. Grant ran on the Republican ticket. They sent federal troops down to protect them. But by the 1930s, after the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal and the offering of federal relief programs, even though Blacks got less, while it was not equal, these programs, right, allowed some Black folks to survive. A lot of them excluded Black sharecroppers and domestic workers, but it still gave more support than the Democrats had ever given them. And people started to turn over in the 30s. Economic survival is important. It's important. Blacks started to cross over into the Democrats because jobs, food, housing, it allowed them to feel like they mattered. However, the Republican Party, though it would say it was more conservative and kind of went along with some Black life, they eventually, by the 60s and the 70s, they adopted what is known as the white Southern strategy. They courted white Southern voters by opposing everything that had been pushed for in civil rights. And they appealed to racial resentment. When we look at why they flipped the flopped, that's why. Jim Crow pushed that. Jim Crow laws pushed that. New Deal programs pushed that. The emergence of Kennedy and LBJ pushed that. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 pushed that. The civil rights era in itself pushed that. There are reasons that it worked, and then there are reasons that it didn't work. Because again, while all of that was going on, there was still failure. Obama. This is probably going to be very unpopular to many people. Many people thought that when Barack Obama came in the office of the president, he would bring change for Black communities. However, when he came in, he emphasized that he was going to support everybody. He told us, what was the quote? Rising tides lift all boats, right? He rarely pushed for Black specific remedies, even when Black children were being killed. And many felt he avoided race-specific issues to keep his white voters comfortable. And there is truth to that. There is truth to that. His DOJ appointees, Eric Holder and later Loretta Lynch, tried to fight against police brutality, and they got eviscerated a lot of times in the public. And very rarely did he come to their defense in a way that you see now with the current administration. And unfortunately, it was a letdown. But here's the thing. He was the first Black president out of all of the white presidents that we've ever had. I'm not giving him a pass. I'm saying that there are pressures on that we don't talk about, that we don't want to face. Right? Because in the end of the day, he is the president of everybody. He was right in that. But there is also this situation where he failed. Right? Because people see him as a symbol of what could have been. And then they see what is going on now. And they say, man, if they could do all that they're doing right now, why didn't you do even half or anything to make it a little easier for some of us to right the tides, as you said, to allow everybody to float? Because while you embrace universal policies, healthcare reform, all these different things, you still, what you didn't see was the stratified America that you knew existed. So if you lift a little bit at the bottom, it doesn't equate to what is at the top. The race neutral stance, though positive and nice, you are avoiding these systemic racist issues that still were apparent in the country then and have become worse now. And not addressing it then, some could argue have made them worse now. Whereas a person of color, a Black person, you could prioritize keeping white voters aware without making them overly comfortable. At the deriding of Black-focused remedies, of the education remedies, of the shortfalls. Barack Obama did a lot of symbolical things. And only after coming out of office did I think he realizes that there are many things that he failed at. He tried different programs, My Brother's Keeper, but in the end of the day, right, you have to be a little bit more engaged. What did you say here? Clarence Thomas is another example of Black people in power. Doesn't mean that they will govern or make decisions, and they won't. And in many cases, like Justice Thomas, they came into office already with an agreement of what they would not do. So, you know, it's one of those situations where we have to look at it and say, man, you know, a lot of this stuff could have been better, could have been done better. It was a lot to unpack tonight. I tried to not be as loud tonight and to kind of take my time going through some things I really wanted to talk about tonight. But I really, really thank all of you. We're getting into the last 5 minutes of the program. I know we're on a little bit late tonight, and I appreciate you, Eric, for being on. Those of you who are joined us, didn't let us know you joined us. I appreciate you all for being here with us tonight. Phone went off, but you know, erudition is such an important thing to me. I have not been able to do the program over the last week because I was ill, and I am a lot better now. But I was very ill, and it kind of upset me because I wasn't able to be on to discuss some things. There's some things I really want us to get into over this particular period of time with erudition. So I don't want you to come away from this with a negative thought. You know, we've seen some negative things. We've covered some negative things here tonight. But I want you to walk away with every episode of erudition with the idea that, you know, America has been a challenge. And every day, we fight to make things easier, better. You know, Dr. King said we are not makers of history. We are made by history. And we just have to keep our heads up, keep fighting, keep telling ourselves, you know, we can make a difference. And learning about your history is a way for you to start to make that difference. Start to grow in your knowledge. Start to be better with your understanding. So when you see false things or things that don't make sense, you will be able to respond to them. I want to thank you for staying with me through this talk, and I know it's difficult. I feel that this is important, and I thank every one of you all. I invite you to reflect. I invite you to further ask questions or anything we talked about tonight. You can send them to on YouTube or on Facebook or whatever you're watching it through. And you can continue this conversation, some things we talked about in your own circles. And I guarantee you will grow and they will grow. I want you to stay safe over the rest of this coming week. Stay curious. And as always, stay erudite and join Erudition Network weekly as we get on. Tina will be on Monday. I am on Saturdays. Thank you all again. Thank you, Eric. Oh, lastly, if you feel that you want to help Erudition Network in any kind of way financially, our ticker is now on our screen. Our Cash App is at $ the Erudition Network, $ the Erudition Network. Everything that you give or provide goes into helping with the program, helping us with our cameras, or things that we do to make these episodes and some of the videos that we put on the channel available to you. So if you want sources or books or information about anything that we talked tonight, please inquire about it in the chat, as I said, and I will do my best to provide that for you. Places where you can go to grow your knowledge. I'm always about that. I think I've said pretty much everything that I wanted to say tonight. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're about at that hour. I hope to see you all, God willing, next week. You all be blessed. Have a great one, and share this episode. If you do nothing else, share this episode, subscribe and share. Subscribe and share. That will help. All right, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, you all be blessed. Thank you.
From Eddie K. Phillips, founder of the Erudition Network, comes 101 Black History Questions, a groundbreaking book that challenges what you thought you knew and uncovers the stories history tried to hide. Perfect for classrooms, families, and curious minds. Get the digital copy today on Amazon.